Hello and welcome. My name is Joe Phippen, and I'm going to be hosting Chinese Intentions in the Neighboring Seas. This is in partial fulfillment of my final presentation assignment for International Relations 600 at American Military University, American Public University System, taught by Dr. John Becker. Here, we're going to take a look at the background of the South China Sea and the current operations that are happening there, as well as what international law has to inform us on the situation. This will provide us a context upon which we're going to analyze the motivating factors that China has to play in the region, as well as looking at what their actions indicate as to their intentions. We will conclude by determining that the Chinese are in fact attempting to establish slow-motion regional hegemony, as Patrick Cronin put it in an NPR interview, and that the U.S. will take certain countermeasures for those intentions that China is acting upon. But first, let's take a look at the location where all this is happening. After all, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and a walkthrough on the map is certainly in order. Taking a look at the globe, we can pan over to the South China Sea. And over there in the South China Sea, we can determine that certain key factors and geopolitical implications will show us that Vietnam here, the Philippines over here to the east, Brunei to the south, as well as Malaysia and bits of Indonesia, all have immediate neighboring effects on the South China Sea, and specifically the Spratly Island groupings found right here. Of course, China, as the big neighbor to the north, and Taiwan to the northeast, are also factors in this query and the central role in which we are going to analyze. In this location, China has asserted, as of late, with their actions and also with their rhetoric for many years, what they call the 9-dash line. This 9-dash line is composed of, well, 9 dashes that show us exactly where their claims lie. Among these 9 dashes of lines falls in almost the entirety of the South China Sea, up to and including, of course, Taiwan and little bits of even Japan islands that outcrop into what is Chinese claimed territory as well. Recent activity in the region shows that China has taken a keen interest in what's been going on there. Within the Spratly Island grouping, again, to look back at where we're looking, this grouping here, the Chinese have long since claimed many of the islands, reefs, and other formations down there, but have not really occupied them in much force. However, a brief look at the imagery will show that this has changed, and changed quite rapidly and quite significantly over just the last year and a half time frame. This imagery from January 22nd, 2002 shows Fury Cross Reef. Fury Cross Reef is but one of the island formations that are there. But to call it an island might be inaccurate, especially in light of the international legal situation. Here you'll see what looks like an island, but at high tide, the entire thing is submerged by water, which, under the UN Convention of the Law of the Seas, initially ratified in 1982, does not qualify as an island. Furthermore, it will be submerged at high tide and isn't really usable for land animals such as humans. Consequently, the Chinese built a small pier near the southern tip of Fury Cross Reef. Fury Cross Reef, as I said before, is but one of the islands, but it is well representative of several of the other reefs and submerged water fixtures in the Spratly Island grouping that China has claim to. And it's also a good representative model on what other things China is taking upon themselves to accomplish there. This imagery shows that in January of 2006, and then again in September of 2009, not much changes. And in fact, looking at the vessels that frequent the area, it was usually of smaller military-type craft. This one in particular shows a utility helipad in the back and some turrets on the front. Clearly a military vessel patrolling the seas or sailing in the high seas, as it were. However, as of late, August 14, 2014, this image was taken, and we start to see a different type of craft. This kind of craft is what's called a dredging boat or vessel. What it does is it takes dirt, sand, soil from the bottom, and it will pump it through a hose to a higher tide, or a higher elevated area. This has the effect of creating an island. Back to this major image of Fury Cross Reef, we can see, taken in 2014, near the top of the island, or excuse me, near the northeast of the island, we can see that the sand gets lighter. That's because this sand is now no longer submerged by water, but is being brought to the surface. Taking a closer look, you can see this boat dredge with his long hose pumping the sand out onto the top, effectively reclaiming the reef into what the UNCLOS Treaty would call an artificial island. This isn't unusual, and it's not particularly forbidden by the UNCLOS either, but the size and scope that this is happening in is immense. This picture here you see is taken on September 26, 2014, just over a month, and there's quite a bit of progress. Not only is there a lot of progress, but instead of one, there is 2, 4, 6, 7 dredges beginning to work on this artificial island. And the work continues at a perhaps exponential rate. The next set of photos here in November, only a month and some change afterwards, and the island has nearly tripled in size of reclaimed territory. And you can see even more dredges, and upon closer inspection, lots and lots of hardware is beginning to compile there as well. By February of this year, nearly the entire island is reclaimed, and in a sizable bay that can take huge oil tankers and even military heavy craft can be docked inside here. By June, just last month of this year, the entire island is almost taken. A 3,000-meter runway has been erected, and nearly 3 million square kilometers of land has been reclaimed for use. Military hardware has been stationed there, and up to 9 possible gun emplacements on Fury Cross Reef alone. And like I said, this is but one of the areas where China is doing this. So what does international law have to say for all of this? Well, as I have already related, the primary governance over the law of the sea is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, originally incepted in 1982. Reefs, submerged landforms, and artificial islands and the like are covered beginning in Article 60. Specifically, artificial islands do not count towards the 12 nautical mile territorial water nor the 200 exclusive economic zone waters that are provided for in Articles 3 and 7 of the UNCLOS Treaty. One interesting exception to this, and something we'll get back to a little bit later in our presentation here, is archipelagic outcroppings, which are covered in Articles 46 through 54, which can in fact bring with it more than just the 12 nautical mile territorial water from the coastal edge for that country to claim sovereign rights to. In the event that you have adjacent coastal states or territorial rights that might overlap or interdict one another, that's covered by principles in Article 15, and although outside the scope of this particular presentation, significant case law since then has developed such that there is venue for resolution on how to draw the lines between countries when there are disputes. Certainly, if we look back at the South China Sea and the overlaying countries, you can see that the South China Sea has many, many countries, and this is nowhere near the 200 nautical miles of distance between the two. So this area is a very hotly contested one. In fact, if we look at distances between Chinese claimed area, which is all-encompassing this 9-dashed line here, the blue dotted line, and you measure the distances from Chinese-controlled landforms and reefs up into neighboring countries, you'll see that China has an overwhelmingly far more than median share provided for in Article 15 of UNCLOS than what it would afford them. The red lines you see indicate how far it is from the 9-dash line to a neighboring country's recognized sovereign land. The yellow lines are from Chinese islands or controlled or administered reefs or whatever have you. As you can see, this 9-dash line takes up quite a bit of space, and when compared with the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas, is more than their fair share by a long shot. Activities authorized on the high seas are those Well, let's start with this. The high seas are areas where states are not able to claim territorial nor exclusive economic zone rights. These are usually best understood as places like the Pacific Ocean, where no one has claim. Articles 86 through 120 of UNCLOS go into great detail on what is and is not authorized. And in the beginning of the UNCLOS, it also specifies that the UNCLOS does not only apply to the surface of the waters, but the airspace above it as well. One of the activities that are authorized is freedom of navigation of either seacraft or aircraft. However, when an aircraft is approaching a state, that state is entitled to some protection, and by that, states usually erect what's called an air defense identification zone. Great study has been taken on these ADIZs in relevance with international law concerning the Chicago Treaty, which governs aerospace, as well as UNCLOS. Folks like Ogunbanwo, Quadra, and Dutton have gone to great lengths and discussed the ramifications of what an ADIZ is and what it is not, and we'll discuss those a little later. Suffice to say here, international law authorizes freedom of navigation and activities that are conducive to the betterment of all mankind. They also authorize economic gathering of resources on the high seas, but no country has exclusive claims to those. Moving on, let's take a look at the contemporary history of the Spratly Islands. Shen in 1994 discusses specifically the Chinese policy vis-a-vis the Philippines and Vietnam. He discusses that the Philippines and Vietnam were far quicker to occupy lands, reefs, and islets in the Spratly Island grouping, and that China had taken more of a passive approach and seen the Philippines and Vietnams lesser as rivals, but in the context of Soviet anxiety to the north, they looked at the Philippines and Vietnam as allies to be won over a little bit slower. Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia perhaps have less claim to the Spratly Islands, but nevertheless are part of the play of the problem here. Of course, other disputes in the South China Sea include Taiwan, of which there has been great anxiety over mainland China regarding the sovereignty of Taiwan. That, in and of itself, could overwhelm this presentation, but suffice to say, it is yet another island dispute going on in the South China Sea. For more information on Taiwan, I recommend an extensively long reading, perhaps starting with Henry Kissinger's book on China, which we'll reference later. Another island dispute, perhaps neighboring or contained within the South China Sea, is Senkaku, or Diaoyu Islands. It's a Sino-Japanese dispute just northeast of Taiwan, and it's an island that is just off of the archipelagic outcropping of Japan to its south. Looking here, we can see that this island, shown here by the yellow dot, is one in which the Japanese and the Chinese are both making claims over, but currently is administered and occupied by Japanese nationals. Currently, in the Spratly Islands, as we discussed, China is reclaiming many lands, and although those lands do not carry with it territorial rights because they are artificial islands, China recognizes this. However, claims that these islands and the entire territory as territorial rights based under the fact that everything under the 9 dash line is Chinese territory from historical claims. Historical claims dating before the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas can and are recognized in some circumstances, but where there are disputes, the express laws set at 1982 and forth tend to override. Nevertheless, it's a sticking point for China and the others in the region. So what motivating factors does China have here? Well, first, there's that territorial claim to both Taiwan and the 9 dash line as a whole, as I was just discussing. These claims are domestic in nature, and as Holmes and Yoshihara assert, as well as Swanson in 1979, these nationalist claims are conducive to a domestic audience, and that domestic audience and the national psyche is not something that can be changed or even compromised very well in a foreign policy setting. For example, if we take a look back at the Takashima or Diaoyu Islands dispute with Japan and the Nine-Dash Line as a whole, it may be diplomatically or from a foreign policy perspective easy to concede that those rocks are really not worth a whole lot of consternation. But the national psyche claiming older and dynastic claims to these lands is something a little bit more difficult to give up. And although a foreign policy expert may give up those islands in a negotiation rather easily, it's not something that can be well swallowed by a domestic audience. Furthermore, there is concern for control of resources in the South China Sea. As we saw on the map, South China Sea is a sizable area. And if we look at the map some more, we'll realize that China, whether it's the East China Sea or the South China Sea, does not have direct access to an ocean. And for a country or a state that has nearly half the world's population, or excuse me, nearly a third of the world's population, and to have restricted access to the largest ocean is something that China does not take very nicely well to. Furthermore, as mentioned by Masuda in his 2007 article, he points out that oil is an actual interest of the South China Sea as well. From this figure, taken from his article, we see choke points of maritime oil transportation worldwide. And in the South China Sea, conspicuously, you'll notice that 11 million barrels a day were flowing through there in the early 2000s. This trafficked area was second only to the Straits of Hormuz in the Middle East, a well-known area and source for oil production. If the South China Sea is the choke point to which all this oil comes through, it's important to also note that these sea lanes coming on a northeastern flow from the South China Sea up to major places like the Philippines, Vietnam, China, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, and even Vladivostok in Russia. This is a key choke point that, if controlled by the Chinese, could be very lucrative through embargoes, tariffs, taxes, or whatever else have you. The fact that they can control this flow through assertive powers in the South China Sea is very significant in a geopolitical and economic context. Furthermore, they have regional and global security issues to be obtained here in the South China Sea. As already mentioned, China does not have direct access to open blue waters such as the Pacific Ocean, and the South China Sea is less restrictive than perhaps the West China Sea, where they have near-peer or other first and advanced nations such as such as Korea and Japan, who would be able to detect submarine traffic transiting through. South China Sea, on the other hand, if it was territorial waters of China, would provide open blue waters for naval maneuvers to include submarine navigation that would go unnoticed by the United States and her allies in the West China Sea. After the submarines are enjoying their freedom of navigation, this also allows China to mitigate any airborne threats that they may have from the South China Sea. Now, we're not talking about first world countries flying bombers directly from the south to mainland China here, but rather the presence of foreign surveillance aircraft that are in the area that can capture emissions of radio signals between blue water craft communicating or underwater craft communicating with one another, or even aircraft flying above international waters conducting freedom of navigation missions and also collecting foreign intelligence through imagery or other electromagnetic spectral imaging of things going on the Chinese mainland. Overall, this entire global and regional security framework seeks to counter the U.S. hegemony in the Pacific. In the late 1970s, when the United States and China normalized diplomatic relations, one of the key breakthroughs diplomatically that came to allow this to happen was the anti-hegemony clause in that joint communique. As discussed by Henry Kissinger in his book, this was basically the linchpin that allowed it all to happen. Now, the anti-hegemony clause then was more of an affront to the Soviet Union without having to name them, as the Chinese were worried about the influence of them on the northern border, and of course the United States was worried about the influence that they had in the Pacific. So together, this was to serve that construct. Now, the circumstances have changed since then, and the U.S. basically does have hegemonic status over the Pacific as a whole, and these are steps that China can take to counterbalance that. So these motivations are all great, but what actions have they taken? Similar to Kissinger's observation in the late 1970s when he was making that agreement that we already discussed, so did Admiral Sun in the Shangri-La Dialogue earlier this year say that if you really want to understand China, you need to look at their actions as opposed to just their rhetoric. So let's do just that. French reports in his article that the Filipinos have deferred their case of boat incursions with the Chinese Coast Guard as well as the island dispute as a whole to the International Court of Justice at The Hague for arbitration. And the Chinese, in response, forthwith denied recognizing the appropriateness of that arbitration, and they're not going to be party to it. Furthermore, they're building a presence of their own in the area to counterbalance the already existing Vietnamese and Filipino presence on the Spratly Island groups. Also, something that the Chinese have physically done in the region is discouraging overflight, issuing aircraft warnings to passing military aircraft. As widely reported in the media, and as you can listen to on some of the podcasts referenced below, such as NPR, the Diplomat, or the CSIS podcast, you can hear the actual recording that the Department of Defense released, whereupon a United States aircraft transiting the South China Sea happens across a Chinese vessel that warns them that they have entered Chinese-controlled airspace and that they need to depart immediately. Furthermore, at the Shangri-La Dialogue and in other venues, folks like Admiral Sun and Colonel Yu would suggest that nations not in the South China Sea should stay out of the South China Sea island disputes. Of course, they didn't name the United States in this accusation, if you will, but it was pretty clear that that's who they were referring to. Another action that they take on a diplomatic front is that they seek to drive a wedge between the Japanese, Korean, and United States trilateral relationship in the region. Again, probably as a disintegration of the U.S. hegemony that already seems to exist in the region. Now, what do I mean by they drive a wedge? Well, in the Seoul Defense Dialogues in October 2014, the Chinese delegation was given a question to them in which they were basically asked why they can't come to terms with the Senkaku and Diaoyu Island dispute between them and Japan. Now, they evaded the questions, and I'm paraphrasing here from my notes, but the response was along the lines of this. We in China find it interesting that the United States would take such a strong position that they will back Japan if they were to come to an armed conflict with China over these islands. Because in the same vein, if we apply that policy setting to Dokdo or the Takashima Islands, which is an island dispute between the Koreans and the Japanese, that if Japan and Korea were to go to the use of force in that dispute, the United States, because of their mutual defense treaty with Korea, would be obligated to deploy troops in support of the Korean conflict. But that those troops would come from Japan, where they're based, and the United States would need to then ask Japan permission to deploy combat troops from their soil to aid South Korea in an armed conflict with Japan. Of course, this caused a little bit of a tussle in the discussion, and it departs from where it's relevant here. But nevertheless, by evading the question but still highlighting that there is turmoil in that trilateral relationship, it does drive a wedge between those three partners. Furthermore, the establishment of the Air Defense Identification Zone in the West China Sea and over South China Sea vessels when they're there is an action that China has taken that clearly shows that they are asserting their territorial claims. Now, as discussed in Shimatsu's article, he shows and delineates where those lines are, and they go over the top of places like the Senkaku Islands that are in dispute with the Japanese. It also goes over the top of, interestingly enough, an underwater rock formation that's disputed between the Koreans and the Chinese as well. In this case, under international law, the ADIZ does not carry with it territorial rights. However, it is an assertion of control of the area as as an aircraft enters the ATIS, they are then required by the host country to identify themselves and their direction of travel. If they don't, typically military aircraft is scurried up and dispatched to escort that aircraft outside of the zone. This could escalate all the way up into shooting them down, which happened a few times in the course of history. And for more details, please look at the articles already referenced on international law and the ATIS specifically. But the fact of the matter is, it's very uncommon, despite how hazy of an area it is within the international legal system. In conclusion, what we see is that China is indeed attempting to establish a slow-motion regional hegemony over the region. They're also using this using these actions to exercise what the United States now calls anti-access or area denial techniques against other nations. The Chinese have a far-sighted mindset, and they're going to shelve these more difficult issues they have with the United States while simultaneously developing relationships along other lines such as economics or trade agreements. The United States, to counter these growing, I wouldn't quite say threats, but the growing concerns of Chinese assertion of power, they're going to continue to exercise freedom navigation missions, as stated by Secretary Carter and as reported by Kronk in his article earlier this year. They ought to ratify the UNCLOS Treaty. As discussed, the United States is not party to it. So even if China is to trespass against the United States and challenge that freedom of navigation, they are lacking a venue in which to bring to arbitration. Additionally, the United States may lobby for Japanese and Korean reconciliation of island disputes, wartime atrocities, and other historical issues that the two partners have between them to create a stronger alliance between the three to counter this growing Chinese influence. Davis, in his 2015 article, surmises that the reconciliation of Senkaku and Dokdo Islands, Senkaku Diaoyu Islands in the south of Japan and the Dokdo Takashima Islands in the west of Japan would seek to pave the way for these further reconciliatory actions. However, as already discussed, China is in no mood to reconcile these islands' disputes with the Japanese or the Koreans because of the gains they are getting from it. I'm interested to hear your feedback in what you have to say about my position here. Please take a look at my references and the data that we've presented. And if you see anything that is missing or perhaps would be a good read, by all means, put it in the comments below, and we will continue the discussion.